Welcome to Whispers and Confessions. There might be a twist waiting, so please make sure to watch until the end. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Let's begin right away.
Hello, my name is Jason. Let me tell you a story about something that happened at a hotel in a tourist spot. Three couples gathered together, and the husbands drew one of three room keys from a box while the wives waited in different rooms. I pulled the key for a room where a 31-year-old teacher, who wore glasses, was waiting. At first, she seemed innocent, but as soon as I closed the door, she revealed a boldness I hadn't expected. We explored each other with passion, and at one point, I heard my wife's voice coming from the next room. A flash of jealousy hit me. Thinking about the physical presence of the teacher's husband, I became even more intense without realizing it. This is what's called a couple shared experience trip. It's a unique kind of vacation where several couples who don't know each other meet through a website and embark on a journey together. Once the trip starts, spouses essentially become shared resources. I had such an experience not too long ago, but this time, things took a turn I didn't see coming, a life-altering event, to be exact. It all started with a suggestion from my wife, Jenny. We had been married for 10 years, and the monotony of daily life had drained the passion from our relationship. With no kids, we were stuck in a serious rut, even considering divorce. On the day I tried to have an honest conversation with Jenny, something unexpected happened. She was home earlier than usual, and when I walked in, she looked visibly startled. Curious, I glanced at her laptop while she was cooking. To my shock, the screen showed a website for a couple shared experience trip. I clicked around the site and was quickly hit with a realization. This wasn't just some casual group vacation. It was essentially a refined version of a swingers club. The website had strict requirements for joining. First, every couple had to pay a one-time certification fee of $500. Secondly, both spouses had to be under 40 years old and hold at least a 4-year college degree. New members, once certified, could participate in these trips only once a month, and each trip was limited to 3 couples. Silver members could either host or join 2 trips a month, with up to 10 couples allowed. As for gold members, the details were hidden, accessible only to higher-ranking members. There were also detailed guidelines for new members' first trip. For instance, couples would spend 100 days getting to know each other online before meeting at a selected destination. On the day of the trip, 3 wives would each enter random rooms, and the husbands would draw keys from a box. The key you pulled would lead you to a wife, but you wouldn't know whose wife it was until you opened the door. That night, she would be yours. Reading this filled me with a strange excitement, and vivid images began forming in my mind. What would it be like to join one of these trips with Jenny? How would it feel if I pulled the key to another man's wife and someone else pulled Jenny's key? What if our rooms were next to each other? The thrill made my heart race, and my body felt a surge of heat. At that moment, I didn't even notice the door quietly open behind me. Jenny had come into the room, but I was too absorbed in what I was reading, too caught up in my own fantasies, to realize it. Suddenly, she snatched the laptop from my hands and snapped it shut. "How could you look at my computer without asking? That's incredibly rude," she snapped, her face flushed with anger. I was confused. How had my traditionally conservative wife, a civil servant, even discovered a site like this? "What's with the look on your face? Don't act like you don't know me," Jenny said, her voice harsh but her eyes avoiding mine. Her embarrassed and tense expression suddenly made her seem attractive. Seeing her in this new light, I realized she was actually quite beautiful. Standing about 5 feet 5 inches and just under 120 pounds, she had soft, fair skin. Every time we were intimate, she gave me complete control, and now, with the strong psychological undertone of what I had just read, I found myself wanting her right then and there. My eyes hungrily scanned her body. Feeling my gaze, Jenny shifted uncomfortably and said, "Stop staring at me like that. Have you lost your mind?" She hugged the laptop to her chest and tried to leave the room. As I watched her slender figure, the curve of her hips swaying as she walked, the desire that had been building in me exploded. I rushed forward without hesitation and grabbed her by the waist. I pushed her roughly against the wall. Afterward, as Jenny lay resting against my arm, her long, fragrant hair tangled in my fingers, I asked the question that had been burning in my mind. How did you find that website? Who told you about it? She hesitated but finally admitted the truth. It turned out that one of her female colleagues had recommended the site. Jenny had confided in her about the issues in our marriage and how we were on the brink of divorce. Her colleague had suggested the trip as a way to spice things up, leaving the decision entirely up to Jenny. Once I understood the situation, I carefully asked her, "So, do you want to try one of these trips?" Jenny looked at me with wide eyes, startled. "No, I'm scared," she said. At first, I felt disappointed, but then something didn't sit right with me. I decided to push her a little further. "Our marriage really does have problems, Jenny. We need a change. If we don't try something new, I don't see how we can avoid divorce." Her eyes filled with tears, but she understood what I was implying. "Jason, don't pressure me like this. Give me some time to think." She stared at the floor for a while, then sighed and finally said, "All right, I'll go on the trip with you. But promise me one thing: you won't hate me afterward." I was taken aback. Given Jenny's personality, I hadn't expected her to agree so easily, but I was too excited to think deeply about it. I just wanted to find two other couples, head to a destination, and start the key drawing game. The certification process was quite strict. We followed the instructions carefully, and after some time, we were finally able to begin matching with other couples. I was so excited my hands were shaking as I logged into the bronze members matching page. I set the location to a nearby area and chose couples under 35. The page filled with over 20 couples eager to participate. Quickly scanning through them, I locked onto a couple that caught my eye: a white-collar pair. The wife had a striking figure and long legs, exactly my type. After selecting them, I was about to choose a second couple when Jenny suddenly grabbed my hand and said, "Let me pick the second couple." I couldn't argue with her, afraid she might change her mind, so I handed over the mouse. Soon, she made her choice: a quiet-looking couple who were both teachers. The husband was tall and muscular, and the wife had a reserved, intellectual air about her, with a slim build. Their profile noted that the wife was a homeroom teacher. "Okay, let's go with them," I said and sent the invite. The next day at noon, the three couples met for the first time on a train headed to a popular resort destination. The white-collar husband's name was Ben, and his wife was Amanda. The teacher couple was Luke and Sarah. Everyone knew why we were on this trip, so the awkwardness I had anticipated never materialized. We played cards, drank, and chatted throughout the journey, becoming fast friends. When we arrived at the resort, it was still daylight, but we immediately checked into the hotel and booked 3 double rooms. Luke impatiently pulled out a small box and placed his room key inside. Seeing this, Sarah blushed and quietly returned to her room. Jenny gave me a complicated look before heading into her own room without saying a word. But my eyes were only on Amanda. Her figure was incredible, and the way she swayed her hips as she walked was feline-like. I really hoped I would draw her key. "Your turn. Put your key in the box," Ben said with a smile, seemingly unconcerned about my staring at his wife. I quickly dropped my key into the box, and Luke began shaking it. "I'll go first," Luke said, since he had been the one to shake the box. When Luke drew his key, a flash of excitement crossed his face. 709, it was Jenny's room. With my wife in someone else's hands, I had no reason to hold back. Reaching into the box, I silently prayed for Amanda's key. But the number I pulled was 708, which meant Sarah, the teacher's wife. Ben didn't even bother drawing. The last key was for room 707, where Amanda was waiting. It was one of the website's rules. Even if you drew your own wife's key, you couldn't ask for a redraw. If Ben wanted to experience someone else's wife, he would have to wait until the next round tomorrow. After that, I went first. Luke gave a nod and went into Jenny's room. As I hesitated, Ben pushed me and said, "Go on. Who knows what he's doing with your wife right now?" I hurriedly grabbed the key to room 708 and opened the door. Deep down, I was still thinking, even though it's not Amanda, Sarah isn't a bad option either. Her graceful features were even a little more refined than Jenny's. When the door opened, Sarah, who had been sitting on the bed, stood up, startled. "Oh, it's you," she said softly, her face quickly flushing red. her eyes filled with shyness. And Luke? Who did he? I trailed off, pointing at the neighboring room. Jenny. I expected Sarah to look uneasy or uncomfortable, but instead, she smiled. Well, this works out then. No need for any of us to feel guilty, she said. Her words ignited something in me, and in a sudden rush, I pulled her into an embrace. However, she seemed a bit tense, her fingers nervously fiddling with my shirt, her brow slightly furrowed. Seeing this, I had no choice but to run to the bathroom and take a quick shower. When I came out, Sarah had already undressed and was waiting for me under the covers. I immediately responded, rushing to her and pulling her into my arms. Sarah met my passion with her own, but something felt off. Her skin was burning hot, and her heart was racing in a way that seemed almost unnatural. I was about to ask if she was okay, but at that moment, I heard the unmistakable sound of Jenny moaning from the next room. The sounds grew louder, and in my mind, I pictured Luke ravaging her. I chose to ignore Sarah's strange condition and press down harder, trying to drown out Jenny's voice with Sarah's. But Sarah wasn't quite ready. She twisted her hips, resisting me. At the same time, Jenny's moans from the next room intensified, sounding almost exaggerated, as if she was about to lose control completely. The stimulation was overwhelming, impossible to resist. I pushed down on Sarah even harder, trying to force her to match the intensity of the sounds coming from Jenny. The strength of a woman is no match for a man consumed by madness. I easily overpowered Sarah and finally did what I had intended. But Sarah's reaction was far beyond what I expected. As soon as I entered her, she started shaking violently, letting out a loud scream. Then, as if in a daze, she began clawing at the air, her hands trembling so badly that they started bleeding from where her nails had dug into her palms. I was frozen in fear, unable to move. I lightly slapped her face and called her name, Sarah, Sarah. But there was no response. Her face, which had been flushed with heat just moments earlier, was now growing alarmingly pale. It was clear to anyone that something was terribly wrong. I didn't even take the time to put on my clothes. I rushed out of the room completely naked. First, I banged on the door of room 709, telling Luke and Jenny that something had happened to Sarah. Then, I ran to call the hotel staff and asked them to call 911. Ben and Amanda were the first to come out after hearing the commotion. They entered the room, and after seeing Sarah's condition, they immediately said it looked like a medical emergency and that we needed to get her to a hospital right away. Luke arrived slowly. He glanced at his wife lying on the bed but didn't ask what had happened or why 911 hadn't arrived yet. Instead, he coolly called for Amanda to help him get Sarah dressed. Watching this, I felt both relief and dread. Why wasn't Luke more shocked by Sarah's sudden collapse? He wasn't even concerned about getting her help, he just wanted to make sure she was dressed. Something wasn't right. Jenny came out a little later, her face still flushed. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, and I had no idea how to handle the situation. The hotel management quickly realized that I wasn't Sarah's husband and that she had collapsed in my bed. They immediately reported the incident to the police. Soon, paramedics arrived. The moment one of the experienced EMTs saw Sarah, he shook his head. I, even more anxious than Luke, hurriedly asked, "How is she? Will she be okay?" The EMT replied, "From what I can tell, she's showing clear signs of a brain hemorrhage. We can't say whether it's a vein or an artery that's ruptured." I asked the question everyone was dreading. So, is there a good chance she'll survive? As they transferred Sarah to a stretcher and prepared to take her out, the EMT answered offhandedly, "Her chances aren't great. Her family should prepare for the worst." I collapsed onto the floor. Meanwhile, Luke followed the paramedics down the hall, his expression cold and indifferent. Soon after, the local police arrived. After a brief assessment of the situation, they took me to the station for questioning. I was terrified that if I told the truth, both Luke and Jenny would be implicated. Before the trip, I had looked up some information online and discovered that there were legal consequences for inappropriate behavior during chaotic situations, meaning we could all be in serious trouble for what we had done. So, I gritted my teeth and decided not to mention the couple's shared experience website. I just told the police that we had met during the train ride. The officers seemed suspicious. So, you're telling me you and this couple became so friendly after just a single day on a train that you ended up in a situation like this? I knew how absurd it sounded, but I had no other choice. I nodded, saying that's exactly what happened. The officer clearly didn't believe me, but with Sarah in such critical condition and no further evidence, there wasn't much else they could do at the moment. Before leaving, he sneered, "You people really live reckless lives." And with that, they took me to a holding cell. That night felt like an eternity. Every minute dragged by like a year. I lay wide awake, staring at the cell bars, unable to close my eyes for even a moment. The next morning, an officer came to the cell and called my name. For a brief second, I thought I was being released, my legs shaking with anticipation. But instead, they cuffed me again, telling me I was being transferred to a detention center. I felt utterly defeated and came close to spilling everything to the police. But in the end, I held back. During the ride to the detention center, I wanted to ask several times if Sarah had survived, but the officers wouldn't answer, citing investigative protocol. My mind was a mess, filled with visions of Sarah's body being wheeled into a cold morgue. I thought my life was over. Caught up in a criminal case, my future seemed doomed. Once inside the detention center, I decided to go on a hunger strike, hoping it might pressure the investigators into telling me the truth about Sarah's condition. But I was naive. The guards were unfazed. They hooked me up to an 4-drip for glucose, and when I struggled, they chained me to the bed with heavy iron restraints. I spent 7 long days in that detention center. During those 7 days, I had no contact with the outside world. No one could visit me, and my phone had long been confiscated. It wasn't until someone advised me to request a lawyer that I finally managed to contact the officer who had originally arrested me. To my surprise, later that afternoon, he arrived in a car, handled my release paperwork, and took me outside. I couldn't believe I was free. Of course, the first thing I asked was about Sarah's condition. The officer gave me a sideways glance and said, "You're lucky." When Sarah got to the hospital, the vice president of the Neurosurgical Association happened to be giving a lecture there. He personally performed the surgery and pulled her back from the brink of death. Tears welled up in my eyes. Sarah had survived, and I wasn't going to prison. I was overwhelmed with relief. But then I remembered something that didn't sit right with me, and I asked the officer, if they saved her that night, why was I locked up for 7 days? The officer smirked and replied, "That night, they just managed to keep her alive. She needed another surgery after that, and she only woke up last night. You got lucky. If Sarah hadn't made it, you'd be looking at several years behind bars." I was speechless. The police car drove me to the train station. Inside the car, I was still in a daze when the officer asked, "We've returned your phone and wallet, right? You've been cleared of all charges. Don't you want to go home?" Yes, I'm going," I replied, quickly scrambling out of the car. "Sarah's already gone back to her hometown, but I wouldn't bother her anymore if I were you. You don't want to get into any more trouble with her husband," the officer said as a parting warning. I immediately bought a high-speed train ticket and, while waiting for the train, called Jenny. Her tone was calm, almost indifferent. She didn't seem surprised that I had been released, only telling me to come home as soon as possible. Her lack of concern left me feeling uneasy. I also wanted to know how she and Luke had handled the police questioning. How had they managed to hide the fact that we had all met through a couple's swapping website? The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I felt. Something wasn't adding up. 3 hours later, I finally arrived home. After quickly washing up, I replied to the messages and missed calls from work and friends. Then, I sat down to talk with Jenny, eager to understand what had happened while I was in custody. "Nothing much," she said. "We just told the police that we met on the train. Obviously, we couldn't mention the website." There was something strange about her expression. The way she looked at me was completely different from how she used to before the trip. No matter how much we fought in the past, her eyes always held some warmth and affection. But now, her gaze was cold. It was like she was looking at a stranger, and there was even a hint of irritation in her face. What's funny is that at the time, I was comforting myself internally. I thought that maybe Jenny was just in shock from what had happened to Sarah, and that both of us were struggling to process the fact that we had slept with other people. It seemed natural that she wouldn't know how to handle the situation. What I didn't realize back then was that, just a few days later, a random event would reveal Jenny's true self to me. And I had no idea that Sarah's medical incident wasn't just a random accident, but a deliberate attempt on her life. It all started 5 days after I returned home. I was already back at work and staying busy when I received a call from Jenny, though the number was unfamiliar. She explained that her iPhone 13 had fallen off her desk and needed repairs, and the repair shop had asked for her Apple ID to complete the service. Jenny had always struggled with account-related things, and Apple's security system can be tricky. Since I had set up her phone and laptop under my email address, she had to call me for the login details. Normally, she wouldn't have asked, but since her phone was broken, she had no other choice. I stopped what I was doing and quickly gave her the Apple ID and password. After we hung up, I set my phone down, but suddenly, a thought hit me. For the first time, I was curious about who Jenny had been talking to and what kinds of conversations she'd been having. Before the trip, I would have never invaded her privacy like this. But ever since we'd returned from Yosemite, something had changed. I couldn't shake this uncomfortable feeling that something was off. So, I picked up my phone, logged out of my own account, and logged into Jenny's Apple ID. Using iCloud, I was able to download all of the chat records that had been backed up from her phone. Because I had set up her premium membership services, the amount of data available was enormous. There were gigabytes of photos, hundreds of videos, and a massive archive of chat messages. Curious, I started by checking her conversations with the people she messaged most frequently. And that's when I found something that shocked me to my core. In her WhatsApp contacts, there was someone listed under the name Professor Nightmare. Just an hour before, Jenny had been exchanging intimate messages with this person, messages filled with words of affection and longing. For example, Professor Nightmare wrote, "Babe, do you miss me?" And Jenny replied, "I missed you. Have you had lunch yet?" He responded, "I couldn't eat. You're all I've been thinking about, and I can't eat when I'm so consumed by you." Jenny answered, "Be careful. Sarah is getting discharged soon. Let's not do anything that might raise suspicion. We shouldn't meet for a while." But Professor Nightmare protested, "I can't wait that long. I've been holding back for days now. I need to pour everything into your little treasure chest." Jenny responded with a blushing emoji. Then she added, "Our plan was perfect, but that annoying vice president of the Neurosurgical Association ruined everything. What terrible luck. If it weren't for him, we'd be able to do whatever we wanted by now." Professor Nightmare replied, "Don't worry, babe. We'll get Sarah's insurance money, and soon enough, that idiot's house will be ours too. Just watch." That was the most recent conversation. It seemed like Jenny's phone had broken shortly after, and she had probably used a payphone to let Professor Nightmare know what happened. I scrolled further back, reviewing their older messages. The more I read, the colder I felt, as if ice was spreading through my veins. Even though it was the middle of summer, my entire body shivered and my face turned pale. It turned out that Professor Nightmare was Luke. He and Jenny had known each other for 3 years. They both shared a love for mystery novels and had met in an online fan group for the same author. What started as a casual friendship eventually led them to where they were now, hotel rooms. The irony was almost unbearable. Here I had been, complaining about how boring and stale my marriage was, even contemplating divorce. But Jenny had already been cheating on me for 3 years. I had been completely clueless. It was so absurd it was almost laughable. But that wasn't the worst part. What truly chilled me to the bone was what their conversations revealed next. 3 months ago, Jenny had sensed that I was seriously considering divorce. Not wanting to lose everything in the split, she and Luke devised a plan to take my house. She felt she was entitled to it, and without the house, she believed she'd be at a loss. The house, located in one of the best neighborhoods in our city, was over 3,500 square feet and easily worth over $5 million. My parents had used all their retirement savings and taken out a loan to help me buy it, with the understanding that it would be for my future family. Before we got married, Jenny had asked me to put her name on the deed, claiming that her difficult childhood had left her with a constant fear of instability. At the time, our relationship was great, and with my parents' blessing, I agreed. We went to the real estate office and added her name. I never imagined that this simple act of trust would fuel such a vicious scheme. Their plan was to make my death look like an accident, ensuring I ended up in prison. Afterward, Jenny would file for divorce, claiming the house in court. Sarah, too, was a victim of their conspiracy. 6 months ago, she had complained to Luke about persistent headaches, and after a CT scan, a small aneurysm was found in her brain. It wasn't life-threatening at the time, but with proper treatment, she could have been fine. But Luke didn't tell her. He hid the results and lied, saying the scan had been lost. He reassured Sarah that her headaches were just stress-related migraines and gave her medication to manage the pain. What no one knew at the time was that Luke had already taken out multiple life insurance policies on Sarah without her knowledge, preparing for the worst. Luke had even been the one to introduce Jenny to the couple's shared experience website, and he coached her on how to manipulate me into going. They even planned out how to rig the key drawing game so that I would end up in Sarah's room. This twisted pair had spent months meticulously planning everything. They had come so close to succeeding. On the night of the incident, Sarah's aneurysm was already in a critical state, and she had been relying on strong painkillers to manage the unbearable headaches. Luke, showing no remorse, dissolved 6 pills of a potent stimulant into Sarah's tea that night. The drug was known to cause an extreme increase in heart rate and blood pressure enough to be dangerous even for a healthy person, let alone someone with an aneurysm. Luke had knowingly pushed his wife to the brink of death. That explained why I had felt something was wrong with Sarah's body that night. It wasn't just the situation, it was the drugs coursing through her veins, making her condition worse by the second. The more I pieced together, the more horrified I became. The cruelty of this pair of lovers was beyond belief. It was a miracle that Sarah had survived it all, thanks to the presence of a top specialist at the hospital that night. If not for that, she would have died, and I would have been charged with involuntary manslaughter. Luke and Jenny would have been free to live their lives together, selling my house and collecting Sarah's insurance payout before disappearing overseas. I couldn't contain my rage. I wanted to rip those two apart. As soon as the workday ended, I rushed home and sat in the living room, waiting for Jenny. When she arrived, she acted as if nothing was wrong. She had brought my favorite freshwater fish for dinner, along with some dragon fruit, and when she saw me already at home, she playfully asked me to help her with the groceries. I stayed silent, watching her. When she came closer, I suddenly stood up and slapped her hard across the face. Jenny was completely stunned. In all the years we had been together, I had never laid a hand on her. After the shock wore off, she shoved me away and screamed through her tears, "Are you crazy? Why did you hit me?" Without saying a word, I handed her my phone, showing her the saved chat logs. She quickly skimmed through the messages, and as soon as she finished, her face turned deathly pale. "Please, just forgive me this once. I beg you," she whimpered, falling to her knees and clutching at my legs. I looked down at her and said coldly, "There's no need for forgiveness. What you and Luke did is unforgivable. I'm going to contact Sarah and tell her everything." "No, please don't," Jenny pleaded desperately, but I had already made up my mind. I immediately called Sarah and asked her to meet me at a nearby cafe. When she arrived, I showed her all the evidence I had gathered from Jenny's phone. Sarah was shocked and devastated, but she quickly understood the gravity of the situation. "We need to report this to the police," Sarah said, her voice trembling but determined. I nodded in agreement. Together, we went to the police station and filed a report against Jenny and Luke. We provided all the evidence, including the chat logs and details about Luke's attempt on Sarah's life. The police took our statements seriously and immediately began an investigation. Within hours, both Jenny and Luke were taken into custody for questioning. As we left the police station, Sarah turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for telling me the truth," she said. "I can't believe how close I came to." I put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's over now. They can't hurt us anymore." In the days that followed, I began the process of divorcing Jenny. Sarah, too, started divorce proceedings against Luke. We both felt a sense of relief, knowing that justice would be served. As for the house, I decided to keep it. It was a reminder of my parents' love and support, and I wasn't going to let Jenny's betrayal taint that memory. Instead, I focused on healing and moving forward, grateful for the truth that had come to light.